Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun is generally known as one of the epics of science fiction. It's also known as a series that is very dense, difficult to get into, often very confusing, both to first-time readers and those who are going back and rereading the series as well. I'd like to talk a little bit about the series today, and I'd like to do a series of videos covering it from a variety of different angles. Because Gene Wolfe covers so much in these 4 books, with the 5th book being a coda, that being Earth of the New Sun, there are several different angles that I think we can look at the series through. Today I'd like to start with sort of a general review, going over the plot, some of the basic themes and questions that are raised in it, and discussing my thoughts on that. And then I'd also like to do a follow-up video on the first book, The Shadow of the Torturer, talking specifically about many of the spiritual themes and biblical allusions that can be found in the Book of the New Sun. I'm splitting it up a little bit because if I do it all in one video, it'll get overly long and cumbersome. But today we're just talking about Shadow of the Torturer, which is Book 1. Generally, if we're talking about what is the Book of the New Sun about, in case you're not familiar with it, the Book of the New Sun is a fictional autobiography of the future Emperor of Earth, or the Autarch as he is called. His name is Severian. He was raised by torturers, and he claims to have a perfect memory of everything that he's experienced in his life. And this is his account of how he went from being a torturer's apprentice and sort of backed his way into becoming emperor, and the adventures and escapades and dangerous encounters that he had along the way that led to him being put in that position through seemingly chance encounters, encounters with alien beings and supernatural creatures, and how he got there. Gene Wolfe, as an author, before he was an author, was an engineer, and a lot of the intricacies of that former work of his can be found in these books, as there are very, very tiny details that hold a lot of meaning and give clues to some of the general things that he's alluding to in the series. But he was also a devout Catholic, and this is an incredibly Catholic series. If we're talking about how obvious biblical allusions are in fantasy and science fiction, generally people see C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia as being like the most obvious. It's pretty easy to pick out, Aslan as Jesus and similar allegories in that. But then you look at something like The Lord of the Rings, where Tolkien is explicitly Catholic and has even stated that The Lord of the Rings is an explicitly Catholic work as he worked on revising it, even though it didn't initially start that way. But, it's a bit more subtle there. If you're not looking for it, it could be missed, even though all of the clues are there. Book of the New Sun is one level deeper. I could see somebody going into this completely blind and have no idea about Gene Wolfe's faith if he wasn't looking for it. And yet it's all there. And faith and religion is a big theme that Wolfe plays with. Along with, I referenced Severian claiming to have a perfect memory. That question of memory is also a huge theme that is played with here. And what is real? So what is this first book, The Shadow of the Torturer, about? Shadow of the Torturer begins with Severian as a young boy and how he unwittingly finds himself embroiled in a plot against the current Autarch, the current emperor, and he finds himself on the outskirts of this plot, being led by a swashbuckling, heroic, Robin Hood-style character named Vodalis. And then, through various different circumstances, one of Vodalis' followers, or somebody who's at least connected very closely to Vodalis' followers, ends up in the Torturers Guild that Severian is apprenticed to. Her name is Thecla. And through a twisted act of mercy, Severian finds himself more directly being allied with this Vodalis character, and because of this is exiled from the Torturers Guild and sent out to be the executioner / torturer of a faraway town. And he's never left the guild or the city that he was raised in. So he has to go out and set out on this journey. And along the way, in this first book, he seemingly by chance happens upon an ancient religious relic that is called the Claw of the Conciliator. It's like a large gem that has like a large thorn implanted in the middle of it. and he spends a good bit of this book and a good bit of the rest of the series trying to return this relic back to whom it truly does belong to. And that's really the plot of this first book. In terms of a specific through line, it really is the first part of an adventure. If you were to just read this, it would be like reading the first half of Fellowship of the Ring and then complaining that the story isn't complete. It really is one story split up into 4 volumes and should be read as such. You'll get the best reading experience if you read all 4 volumes, and then the follow-up volume, Earth of the New Sun as well, in relatively quick succession, because it does tell one overarching narrative. Even though that's a brief summary of the plot, I hope you can see that Wolfe works on 2 levels here. One is that this is a very pulpy, sword and sorcery style adventure novel. You get a lot of allusions to things like Robert E. Howard's Conan and traditional science fiction type adventure stories, but there's also a very deeply philosophical layer here. There's a lot of things that Wolfe plays with in the text here. Because it is all written as a journal, or as a autobiography, I should say, of Severian, you play a lot with perspective and with how Severian perceives himself and how he perceives those around him, how he views the world. Many of his own ignorances we suffer through as well. We are ignorant of things that maybe he wants to keep secret. We don't get to see as clearly as we would like to, because he is in fact the one narrating his story to us. That plays for a lot of interesting different aspects as the reader when you're actually reading this, especially for the first time. One thing that you will hear very quickly if you know anything about Book of the New Sun is that Severian is a messiah figure type. That is not readily apparent at all in just reading this first book, The Shadow of the Torturer, which is why there will be a follow-up video coming out soon about some of those biblical allusions and hints to that, even in this first volume. So if you're just reading this book and you're looking for it, it might be difficult to see. Wolfe has famously said, though, that he doesn't think of Severian, to quote him specifically, "I do not think of Severian as being a Christ figure. I think of Severian as being a Christian figure. He's a man who's been born into a very perverse background who is gradually trying to become better." And that's a very good way of looking at it. Severian follows a lot of Messiah archetypes, and those foundations are built up in this first book. If that's something that interests you, that will be a great driving factor going forward in the series. But the seeds are first planted in this book. They don't blossom until later on. They become much more apparent in the second and third volume, but they begin here. As I said before, many people see Book of the New Sun as being a challenging read, and one of the things that can appear challenging is it can seem to be a little slow as far as there being a lack of plot in the series. If you heard me describe what the first book is about, it may sound like, well, what's the end goal that we're reaching towards here? What's the driving plot? And even though this is the first part of 4 or 5, depending on how you count it, volumes here, there is obviously a plot here. A plot is simply the ordered sequence of events that make up a narrative. There is a plot here, but that's not the primary focus. This isn't a thriller story. This isn't some tightly woven mystery novel that leaves you with no loose threads. The book is much more a mystery in trying to parse out what Wolfe is doing in the background, things that he's doing in secret, things that he's hiding from the reader, but is all the way along planting breadcrumbs and clues for you to pick up on. Severian, our fictional narrator, knows where this is going to end, and so he, very early on, begins to plant seeds to that and allusions to that, and more of the story becomes unveiled as you go along. You begin to understand more. Many people will also say about Gene Wolfe that you don't read Gene Wolfe, you reread him. And that really is true in the case of Book of the New Sun. When you reread The Shadow of the Torturer after finishing Earth of the New Sun, you will find things that are hidden and things that are alluded to in the opening chapters of Shadow of the Torturer that went completely over your head the first time because you didn't know to look for them. In one of my earlier videos that I did on Book of the New Sun, I referenced the verse that's in the book of Proverbs that says, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings to search it out." And that really could be applied to Gene Wolfe as well, that he loves concealing things, trusting that you, the reader, are smart enough to follow along with him, to play the game that he's setting up, and to be able to play it as well as he can. And if you're not smart enough on the first read, that you'll get it on the second read and the third read. And these books are intentionally written to be 250, 300 pages, to be, in terms of page count, very short reads, so that rereading them is much more of a possibility than if this were some 1,000-page tome or a 12-book series. Another challenge to this series is Wolfe's world building. Because everything is told through the lens of Severian, our narrator, there is nothing that he would assume that you understand that he'll go out of his way to explain. In the same way that if I'm writing in a journal, I don't explain in how I write what a McDonald's is or what a highway is. I assume that my reader, if somebody were to read it, that they would just know what that is. It's a myth that Severian does no exposition, that he doesn't explain anything, and that's not strictly true. He just assumes that you're familiar with his world, that you're as familiar as he is. Some of the more arcane and secret parts of his world, though, he'll go into a lot more depth on. So the rituals of the torturers, or the inside of the citadel where he was raised, some of the secrets and mysteries there, he'll go into a lot more detail on, because he wouldn't assume that a current day reader would know what all of that means. But Severian will refer to creatures that are alien, and that can come across to many readers as confusing, or he'll refer to futuristic vehicles, seemingly just, off the cuff. There are times where he doesn't make a clear distinction between vehicles that travel through the air and vehicles that travel on ground, or even in the water. In his mind, he'll use very similar words for it and just assume that you'll be able to track with it through the context. Wolfe, when he writes the book, almost plays the part of a translator, that he's translating an ancient text, that being, Severian's account. And when translating it for us in the modern day, as it were, he doesn't use any made-up science fiction words. And you'll get that in a lot of sci-fi or even fantasy, of gobbledygook. And Wolfe really leans into this gimmick of pulling very old words that are out of date, or words that maybe aren't English or commonly used in English anymore, instead of just making something up. So one of the common examples that people will use is he will refer to a science fiction-y, futuristic horse-type creature that's not quite a horse. It seems to have talons, and maybe it growls, and it's not exactly a horse, so he doesn't use the word horse, but he uses the word destrier. Now, destrier is by no means an incredibly uncommon word, but it does give a different indication that he's not talking about directly a horse. Another example is that many of the prominent female characters in the book have the title prefix of Shadowlane before their name. And I don't know about you, but I didn't know what that word meant when I first read Book of the New Sun. So one thing that can help improve your reading experience, or help enrich it, rather, is to either have a dictionary nearby or have Google nearby. And when you don't understand a word, look it up and see what maybe some of the deeper implications are, especially when Wolfe is talking about creatures that are alien or supernatural. The words that he uses have very specific connotations based on their older meanings that will help inform you maybe what he's referring to. Even if Severian is confused, you as the reader don't need to be as confused if you understand the words that Wolfe is using. One of the things that I find a lot of value in this series specifically is this question of, is what you're reading deep or wide? And what I mean by that is there are many epic fantasy tomes or science fiction books that are 800, 900, 1,000 pages, and they're very entertaining on a first read, and people enjoy them and they have a good time. But if you go back on a reread, there's little more that you will gain other than just the entertainment of rereading a story. Wolfe intentionally writes with a certain amount of density and layers of meaning within his text, that the rereading of his books contain new levels of meaning that you'll be able to understand, and it almost becomes a completely new experience for you than simply reading it for the first time. I alluded to earlier also that He keeps his page counts short so that rereading it is not as daunting of an idea as maybe rereading something like Stormlight Archive is to many common readers. His books are short, but they are packed with meaning and symbolism and things that you can spend really a lifetime in unpacking and figuring out symbolism and references to whether it's the Bible or to other literature or to mythology that he's included in these books, and even just in this first book of The Shadow of the Torturer. One of the last challenges that I'll allude to about this series is our main character, Severian. This is probably the best indication that Severian is not meant to be taken as a literal Jesus analogy in the story, but rather to be seen as we heard in the Wolfe quote earlier, a Christian figure, not a Christ figure directly, because Severian is not a good person. He comes from a very warped background, obviously being raised by torturers. He has a very problematic worldview, to use that term. One of the things that's often commented on is his view of women. It seems that every woman that he encounters, he seems to fall in love with. And there are things about his personality that are genuinely a problem and that make him unlikable, especially early on. He matures as the series goes on and he grows, but the growth is very realistic. It's not a continual path upwards. He fails, he slips up, he makes very large mistakes, and makes some mistakes that some people will see as unforgivable for some of the crimes that he commits, as it were. Now, because he's our narrator, we are in his head the entire time. There are no other points of view in this story. So if you don't like Severian, or if you don't at least find him interesting, if you can't at least stick with him for the ride, see where he goes, if you can't at least empathize with him on some level, that may make the reading experience more difficult for you. I know for some readers that is a problem, that is a sticking point for them. And even though he's our narrator, he claims to have a perfect memory. Yet there are times when he seems to contradict himself, he seems to brush aside certain events, or maybe recontextualize them later. He is often the poster child for unreliable narrators in fiction. And I don't think that's fully fair to him. I think that, to quote a character speaking of himself later in the series, he lies less often than you think. And one of the ways that you know this is that Severian, if he was just lying about everything that he did, is pretty brutal about some of the bad things that he's done. He's pretty hard on himself at times. Now, he absolutely brushes by some things, and there are some things that he chooses not to focus on. Yet if he were completely lying about who he was and who his character is, you'd think he would come up with a much better picture to paint of himself than the one that he does, which is full of flaws. By the time you get to the end of Shadow of the Torturer, you will get a very good idea if this is a series for you or not. The series gets both easier to read as you go along, and also much more difficult to read. There are crazier things that happen in books 2, 3, and 4 especially than in this first one. The first book is the normal book of the series, but you'll get a good idea whether or not Wolfe's prose is for you, whether or not Severian is a character that you can travel with for 4 or 5 volumes. You'll have a good idea as to whether or not this is a series that will click with you. It is a challenging series, but I think its reputation is a little bit overstated. I think it's much more understandable than people give it credit for. You just can't be reading it expecting Mistborn or A Song of Ice and Fire going into this, because it's not. Wolfe is doing very different things, and if you're expecting the same type of character development or world building that modern fantasy has trained us to be comfortable in, then you might be uncomfortable with many of the things that Wolfe is doing here. But there's a lot of value in being uncomfortable, in challenging yourself, in reading something that will stretch you. And this is only 4 or 5 books long, depending on how you count it. And it's one that, if you're wanting to try reading more challenging fiction, if you want to try asking some more philosophical questions than the basic things that are covered in every general mass audience appeal fantasy novel that you'll read out there, then Gene Wolfe is not a bad person to try. I don't know that there's any metric for a perfect novel, but one of them probably is where there's not a single wasted word. And many Wolfe experts will say that there's not a wasted word in Gene Wolfe's writing, specifically in Book of the New Sun. I can't speak to that directly, but I can say that his writing is incredibly tight, and if you let him, there's a lot of value to be found in this series. One of the things that personally resonates a lot with me is seeing the biblical allusions in the series and some of the spiritual and faith things that he plays with here. I'd like to do a video on that. Hopefully you'll all be able to see it very soon. I'm not a Wolfe expert, but my professional training is in biblical ministry. It is in the faith arena. So that is one thing that I think I can speak to. Even if I'm not a Wolfe expert, I think I can speak to the issues of faith that he wrestles with in this series with a little bit of expertise. So I'd like to go over some of that in a follow-up video here. If you're interested, feel free to follow for that. But I'd like to just leave you with that challenge, to read something that might be out of your comfort zone. I think there's a lot of people who pass on this series out of fear, and I don't think that's right. I think that this series is much more digestible than a lot of people will give it credit for, at least on that surface sword and sorcery level. You don't need to get everything on your first read. You don't need to get everything on your second read, and you're not going to. Accept the story for what it is. Be willing to go on a fun, sci-fi, weird, trippy, dreamlike adventure with Severian, and you will get plenty of value just on that level. But if you want to go deeper, there's plenty more to go. Anyway, that's it for today, guys. Thanks for watching.